David had asked his mother not to come to the ceremony. He was ashamed, not of her, but of what he'd never told her. That for 22 years, she had been cleaning the very building where he now stood, waiting to receive his diploma. She had mopped those floors at 4 in the morning so he could sit in those seats by 9. He found out that morning. She had never said a word. He found out by accident. A laminated badge, left on a break room table where he'd wandered looking for a lost umbrella. Her photo, her name, 22 years stamped in faded ink on the back, dates that started before he could walk on his own. He stood there in his cap and gown, hands gone cold, thinking about every hallway in that building he'd ever walked through like he owned it. Every floor he'd never once looked down at. Every door unlocked before sunrise, so professors could find their rooms warm and ready. So men like him could become whatever they were about to become. He hadn't told her not to come because he didn't want her there. He told her not to come because some part of him already knew. And in 2 hours, he was going to find out exactly how much. Her name was Elena. She came north when David was 2 years old, carrying him on one hip and a single suitcase in the other hand, and a promise she made to herself on the bus that she never once said out loud. He will never know what this costs. That's the part people forget about sacrifice. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for credit. It just shows up at 4 in the morning, laces its shoes, and goes to work while the rest of the world is still asleep, dreaming about the kind of life someone else is busy building for them. She took the job at the university because of a flyer taped to a bus stop. Overnight custodial staff. Benefits after 90 days. She didn't know yet that the building she'd be assigned to, Whitfield Hall, with its tall windows and its marble floor that took 2 hours just to strip and wax, would one day be the exact building her son would walk into as a freshman, 18 years later, without either of them saying a word about it. She never let him see the uniform. Not because she was ashamed of it. She'd tell you, if you asked her, that there is no shame in clean floors and an honest check, but because she'd seen what happens to a child's eyes when they look at their mother and start doing math. Start calculating what they cost. Start carrying weight that was never meant to be theirs. So she became vague. I work downtown, she'd say, at a building. And David, being a child, and then a teenager too busy becoming himself to ask the right questions, never pushed further. He had homework. He had a scholarship essay due. He had a mother who was always tired but never said why, who left before he woke and came home after he was already in bed, who left notes on the counter in handwriting that got smaller every year, like she was trying to take up less space. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't know for another 2 decades, is that some nights, after her shift technically ended, she'd walk the empty halls of Whitfield Hall just to look at the lecture rooms. Empty chairs, chalkboards wiped clean, and she'd imagine, just for a minute, before her knees reminded her she had a bus to catch, what it might feel like to belong in a room like that instead of just keeping it clean for the people who did. She never told anyone that. Why would she? Nobody asks the woman with the mop cart what she's imagining. They just thank her, sometimes, on their way out. Most days, not even that. Here's something strange about the people who raise us in silence. They leave fingerprints everywhere, and we spend years walking past them without noticing. When David was 7, Elena started bringing him to the building on Saturday mornings, before her weekend shift, because she couldn't afford a sitter and the daycare was closed. She'd sit him in the back row of an empty lecture hall with a coloring book while she emptied trash bins 2 floors up. He doesn't remember being told to sit quietly. He remembers the chairs, how they folded down with a heavy, important clack, how the chalkboard at the front looked like a window into something he didn't have a name for yet. By the time he was in high school, he had a name for it. Ambition. He wanted into that world, the one with the chairs and the chalkboards, and the people who got to stand at the front of the room instead of empty it out after everyone left. He told himself it was his idea. Nobody plants a seed and announces it. The tree just grows, and one day you call it yours. He got into the university on scholarship. Whitfield Hall, his mother's building, became his building too. In the way ownership works for the young and the lucky, he walked its halls like a man entitled to its warmth without once asking who had made it warm. And somewhere in those 4 years, something harder set in. Embarrassment. Not of her exactly. He'd tell you that, and half believe it, but of the gap between his life and hers. Of her accent in front of his roommates. Of the hours she worked that he described, when asked, in the vaguest terms he could manage. She works in facilities, he told a girlfriend once, and felt something curdle in his stomach as he said it, though he couldn't have told you what. He didn't know facilities meant his building. He didn't know overnight shift meant she was somewhere in that very structure. Most nights he stayed late studying, 2 floors below him, scrubbing a stairwell he'd jog up without looking down. He didn't know that the warm classroom he sat in for constitutional law at 9 a.m. had been 58 degrees and dark 4 hours earlier, until she walked in, alone, and turned the heat on for men who would never learn her name. This is the quiet cruelty of love done right. It's invisible by design, and the better she did her job, the more invisible she became to the one person she was doing it for. You should know what this cost her, because she never would have told you herself. Her hands, first. By the time David was in college, her hands had the kind of permanent ache that doesn't show up on an X-ray. Just in the way she'd flex her fingers before gripping a coffee cup, every single morning, like she was warming up machinery that had run too many hours for too many years. Her knees went next. Stairwells, mostly. Whitfield Hall had 6 floors and an elevator that was reserved, by unspoken rule, for faculty. But the real cost wasn't physical. The real cost was every version of herself she put down so a version of him could stand up. She'd had dreams once, she'll tell you, if you sit with her long enough and ask gently, about wanting to study nursing back home, before circumstances rearranged her life the way circumstances do. She let that go quietly, the way you let go of a hand on a crowded train platform, telling yourself you'll catch up later, knowing somewhere underneath that you won't. She didn't date much, didn't take vacations. The one time a co-worker invited her to a wedding 3 states away, she calculated the cost of the bus ticket against a month of David's textbooks and stayed home. And she never, not once, told him any of this. Not as guilt, not as leverage, not even as a story to be proud of. When her coworker Dolores, a heavy-set woman who'd worked the day shift in the same building for 11 years and who is, frankly, the only reason any of this came to light, once asked her why she never just told the boy the truth, Elena said something Dolores never forgot. If he knows what it cost, he'll spend his whole life trying to pay me back instead of living it. That's not a sentence you hear in self-help books. That's a sentence you hear from people who've actually given something up. There's a difference between sacrifice as a concept and sacrifice as a Tuesday. As a knee that aches climbing the same 6 flights it's climbed for 8,000 mornings. As a face you keep neutral while your son's roommate calls you the cleaning lady, without unkindness, just without seeing you at all. She never asked to be seen. That was the whole design of the thing. You don't build a floor for people to notice the floor. You build it so they can stand on it without thinking twice. The morning he found out started like any other. He'd come early to Whitfield Hall to find a quiet spot before the ceremony, away from the noise of families taking photos on the lawn. He went looking for the 3rd-floor men's room he remembered from freshman year, took a wrong turn, and ended up in a back hallway he'd never noticed before. The kind of hallway that exists in every building, but only for the people who keep it running. A break room, metal lockers, a bulletin board with a faded shift schedule pinned under a thumbtack, and on the table, a badge, laminated, edges worn soft from 22 years of handling. Her photo, younger, hair darker. Her name, a higher date that made his stomach drop, because he did the math without meaning to, and the math came out to, before I have a single memory that doesn't have her in it. He was still standing there, badge in hand, when Dolores walked in for her shift and found him. She didn't apologize for what she was about to say. She just said it, plainly, The way people who've worked hard their whole lives tend to say true things, without decoration. She told him about the Saturday mornings with the coloring book. She told him Elena used to stand in the back of the auditorium, in the dark, behind the last row, every single time David had a debate competition held in that building at night, because she'd switch her shift just to be there, unseen, and slip out before the lights came up so he'd never have to explain her to his teammates. She told him about the bus ticket to the wedding she never bought. She told him, finally, the sentence that broke something open in his chest. Your mother has cleaned this building since before you could spell your own name, so that you'd never have to clean anything for anybody. She didn't do it so you'd thank her. She did it so you'd never know to. David stood in that break room in his cap and gown, holding a badge that weighed nothing and everything. And for the first time in his adult life, he understood that every door that had ever opened easily for him had been opened, quietly, by someone who made sure it would never look like a favor. Grief and gratitude can feel identical in the first few minutes. David didn't know which one he was standing in. He thought about every facility's comment he'd made. Every time he'd let a friend's joke about janitor's pass without correction because correcting it would have meant explaining himself. Every late night he'd complained about studying too hard, 2 floors above a woman studying nothing but the calculation of how many more years her knees had left in them. He thought about the heat in that 9 a.m. constitutional law classroom, the trash bins that were always empty, the chalkboards that were always clean, like the room was simply built that way, like warmth and order were properties of the building instead of labor performed by a specific, exhausted, devoted human being who happened to be his mother. There's a particular kind of shame that doesn't feel like shame at first. It feels like clarity. Like someone turned the lights on in a room you'd been living in your whole life, and you suddenly see the furniture was never yours. Someone else paid for it, arranged it, dusted it every night while you slept. He didn't cry in that break room, though he came close. What he did instead was quieter, and in its way, more important. He made a decision. He wasn't going to walk across that stage today like a man who built himself out of nothing. He was going to walk across it like a man who finally knew exactly whose shoulders he'd been standing on. He just had to find her first. And he had maybe 40 minutes before the ceremony started. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. I say that because stories like this one only mean something if we sit with them instead of scrolling past them. Most of us have someone like Elena in our lives. Someone whose hands did more for us than their mouth ever let on. Maybe it's not a building they cleaned. Maybe it's a job they hated and never complained about. A meal they didn't eat so you could. A version of themselves they quietly buried so a version of you could grow. This story is for them. Now let's go find her. David found his mother exactly where Dolores said she'd be. In the 3rd floor stairwell, in her uniform, mop in hand, finishing what she'd told her supervisor would be her very last shift. She'd put in her notice 3 weeks earlier. Today was her last day in that building, on purpose, the same day as his graduation, because some part of her, some part she'd never admit to out loud, wanted her hands to be the last hands to touch that floor before she let go of this chapter of her life completely. She hadn't told him that either. He stood at the top of the stairwell for a moment, just watching her. The same motion she'd probably made 10,000 times. Steady, unhurried. A woman doing a job most people walk past without seeing. Doing it the same exact way whether anyone was watching or not. Because that, it turns out, is the whole definition of integrity nobody bothers to teach you in school. Mom, he said. She turned, and for 1 second, just one, he saw something in her face he'd never seen before. Not embarrassment. Fear. Fear that this was the moment, finally, where her son looked at her and saw someone smaller than he used to think she was. He crossed the stairwell, badge still in his hand from that morning, and he did the only thing that made any sense to him in that moment. He took the mop from her hands, set it against the wall, and hugged her in her uniform, in the stairwell, in the building she had given 22 years of her life to, so that he would never have to give a single hour of his to a room like this one. Unless he chose to, the way he was choosing to right now. "I know," he said. "That's all." 2 words. She didn't ask how. She just understood, the way mothers understand most things, a half second before you finish saying them. He didn't let her go home and change. He didn't let her wait outside. David walked his mother through the front doors of Whitfield Hall. Not the staff entrance she'd used for 22 years, but the front, the marble floor she had personally kept gleaming for 2 decades. Past the rows of folding chairs she'd unstacked at 5 that morning without anyone knowing her hands had touched a single one of them. She walked it in her uniform. He didn't ask her to change, and she didn't offer to. There wasn't time, and more than that, there wasn't a reason. Not anymore. When his name was called, he didn't walk to the stage alone. He walked it with her hand in his. Past deans who had no idea who she was. Past classmates who would spend the rest of the day asking each other who that woman was in the gray uniform, walking like she belonged there, because she did, more than any of them. He didn't make a speech. He didn't need to. Some things are said louder by the absence of explanation. What he did, instead, was simple. He asked the dean for 1 minute, and he used it to do the only thing he could think to do with 22 years he could never repay. He asked his mother, in front of several hundred strangers, if she would walk the stage with him. Not behind him, beside him. She did. If this story moved something in you, do 3 things for me. Follow this channel, so you don't miss the next one. Share it with 5 people who'd understand exactly why. You know who they are. And tell me in the comments, who is the Elena in your life? The one who carried something heavy and never once put it down where you could see it? I read every comment. And if there's a story you think the world needs to hear, tell me what it is. I'm always looking for the next one.